Now, as we begin this episode, um, I want to remind you once again that what you're hearing is one side of the book. There's a whole um, series of adventures going on, modern day, simultaneously with this account of Cuto back in 1610. So it's don't forget that. Okay. So, if you remember, Kuto was in the cave. He did have he had made a torch outside from a piece of wood from the bushes outside the entrance. And as he was making his way, he was inside the cave, making his way toward the back of the cave. A figure of a man he caught his eye um, to the left, and he whirled around, grabbed a knife from his belt, and crouched, torch in hand, ready to defend himself against attack. But as the flickering light showed this figure of a man was about full size, he realized that the man wasn't moving. And he stepped closer, his heart pounding, stepped closer to the wall of the cave, and he saw that it was a painting. It was a painting in white of a full-size man. Um, and it had scared him to death. So he kind of chuckled and then waved his torch around, and paintings showed up all over the wall of the cave. Now, most of them were not full size, they were smallish paintings of animals and people hunting animals. He recognized one animal that looked like a jaguar. He recognized some desert sheep. There were many, many paintings all over the walls, small paintings, probably about that big or smaller, but all over the wall. And he thought to himself, well, it had to be the ancient ones, and they must have painted these. Some of them were in color, reddish reds and greens and tans. Some of them were colored. They weren't all just pure white. And he thought the ancients must have painted these paintings by the light of a torch, just like I've got. And at that moment, uh, the torch started to flicker, and he felt air moving in the cave from the back of the cave toward the front of the cave, and his torch was flickering. And he glanced at it, and it was about to go out. So he made his way back to the front of the cave. Now, he was pretty far into the cave uh, when this all happened, and he made his way to the opening of light, the round opening of light, which was about, he had to bend over to get in, but it was a pretty tall opening into the cave. And as he got to the front of the cave, he realized that from the front of the cave, through the bushes, you had an unobstructed view all the way down the whole valley to where the crack in the cliff wall opened into the valley. And he thought, this would be a good place to, if somebody came into the valley, this would be a good place to get to observe their movement. So he rummaged around in the bushes and found another torch and got it going. Lit a fire, he made a fire and got it going, and went back into the cave. And this time he didn't stop at the paintings. He went right towards the end of the cave. And as he got close to the back of the cave, there was a distinct movement of air causing the flames on the torch to flicker. Well, when he got to the back of the cave, he was about 150 feet inside the cave. I mean, it was a long, big cave. He felt he came to the back wall of the cave, and he felt the um, the air coming on his left cheek. And so he turned his head and held the torch out, and he saw a passageway going to the left from the back of the cave. There was a natural passageway in the rock with a sandy floor. It wasn't very wide. So the air was definitely coming from it, and he could hear a faint sound of water. And he thought, this passage must go to where the stream is that comes out of the cliffs and down into the valley. And sure enough, he walked about 40 feet, and there at his feet was bubbling water, the formation of the stream, or the water that formed the stream going down the valley. So he was standing there thinking, wow. And all of a sudden, he noticed the flames of the torch flickering down, not to the side, but down. And he felt air coming down on his head, a current of air. And he tipped his head back and looked up. And way, way above him, he could see a circle of light made by the sky and the sun above him, just a circle in the black. And he realized that he was standing at the bottom of a shaft that went all the way up to the desert floor. And as he was thinking about it, looking at it, something clicked in his head. And he held the torch across the stream, out over the water, and looked around here, there, looked around all over the surface of the rock, and then he saw it. A hole like that in the surface of the rock across the stream from where he was standing. And he raised the torch, and there was another hole, slightly above and to the right of the first one. And he raised the torch higher, and there was another hole to the left of the second hole. And they were oblong and cut into the rock. And they were footholds and handholds. So he waded the stream, got to the other side, found the bottom foothold, and started climbing. And again, in this case, there had been no weather inside this shaft at all, so the holes were perfectly shaped for a hand to grip them and a foot to step in them. And he started climbing, and sure enough, it was a series of cuts making a stairway to the top. And he got about halfway up, and it was pitch dark, but he still had his torch, but the holes were so regular and so secure that he just dropped the torch down into the stream, let it go. And in about 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more, he emerged onto the rim of the desert, or the floor of the desert. And he emerged out of the hole into the entrance of the hole of the shaft was surrounded by rocks. And as he climbed out and stood up, he saw that the rocks were very, very cleverly arranged to match piles of rock lying on the desert floor, so it looked like just another pile of rocks on the desert floor. And unless you were actually standing on the rocks around the edge of the shaft, the hole from the shaft, you would never know it was there. Never know it was there. It was completely disguised and hidden. And he thought to himself, the ancient ones knew what they were doing. So he turned and walked across the desert floor and looked down into the hidden valley. And you could see the whole, I mean, he was 200 feet up, but you could see the whole valley. You could see their camp down at the end, um, and the horses grazing in the grass. And so he walked along the rim all the way up to the end of the valley where the crack came out, where they were camping. And he looked down on his friends and on Rhea. Rhea was doing some cooking, and his friends were busying about. They were starting to lay out patterns for gardens and for 3 small houses. And then he walked along the crack that led from the valley out to the main canyon. And the crack was about 20 feet wide, about as wide up on top as it was down on the bottom. And he couldn't see because it was dark down in there, but he walked all the way along until he was standing above the entrance to the crack at the main canyon. And there was one of his buddies on lookout at the entrance, and he didn't say anything. He was 200 feet up. He was a long way up. But something came to mind about Adzul describing what the Inca people did to defend against horses of the conquistadors 60 years earlier, 60 years before. And he walked slowly back along the edge of the crack, and he thought, we have some work to do up here. And so he got back to where the crack opened out into the valley, into their hidden valley, and looked down on everybody, and then walked along the rim back to the hidden shaft and climbed back down the footholds. They're just perfectly formed and shaped for him. Climbed back down, took him about 10 minutes, climbed back down into the cave, felt his way along the walls of the cave because his torch had gone out, of course, and out into the sunlight. And as he walked down the valley, he was walking along a stream, and he kind of looked over at the horses, and he thought, the 8 horses were grazing, and they'd been there now probably 2 or 3 weeks, and they hadn't paid much attention to the horses. But he looked over at the horses, and he said, man, they look really different. Their coats were shiny. They looked. What had happened was the horses. They didn't know horses, and what had happened was the horses they got from that ambush and rode into the canyon were really thin, not in good shape at all. But in the 2-3 weeks they'd been in the valley, in the hidden valley, they'd had tons of food, water, and they'd filled out. Their coats were shiny, and they were different animals. They were different looking animals, and he went, holy cow! These horses have changed a lot. So he got back down to their camp and told the other Aztecs about the shaft and that they had some work to do up on the desert floor. And he told Rhea about the horses. And that afternoon, Rhea took some dried corn and walked up the valley through the grass, tall grass. I mean, even though the horses were eating grass like crazy, but there was so much grass they couldn't graze down the valley. And she walked up to where the horses were grazing, and with some corn, a little bit of corn in her hand, she walked around the horses. They were not afraid of her. she noticed how shiny and filled out and strong they looked, and she just walked up to them. And of course, they were gentle horses. They were the conquistador horses, so they allowed her to come close. And she held out a little corn. And they would nibble on the corn, and she'd rub their necks and scratch their foreheads. And every once in a while, when she'd walk away from one to another, um, the one she'd been scratching would bump her with its forehead, hoping for some more attention. And there was a stallion. It was a black stallion, and he really looked strong. And the bay and the gray and the pinto and the yellow horse, they all looked really good. And so she walked back down to their camp. And the next morning, she grabbed one of the heavy conquistador bridles and studied it and looked at it and studied it and looked at it, looked, understood how it worked. And then she got some leather, and she spent the next few days working with leather, braiding and working with leather, and walking up to the horse herd, checking what she was doing, coming back, sitting on a stump, braiding with leather. And Cuto loved to watch her work because she'd always been very creative, way back in the days when they were, teenagers. She'd always been creative making stuff. And she sat on this stump with her black hair, shiny black hair hanging down off her shoulders and studying this leather work she was doing. It took her about 4 days. Worked on it constantly. And Cuto came up and said, what are you doing? And she said, you see these heavy things that the conquistadors used, and they have this metal that goes into the horse's mouth. And I have a feeling the horse doesn't like that very much. So I'm trying to make something that would be easier on the horses. At the end of 4 or 5 days, what she'd essentially created, just studying and thinking and going up and trying fittings on the horses, she'd essentially created a hackamore. Now, a hackamore is like a bridle, but it does not have a bit. A hackamore has a ball of leather under the chin of the horse that has no bit. And then there are reins like the conquistador reins, but she'd changed the reins. And she had the reins start on one side of the leather halter she'd made, or leather bridle, and the rein went back in one single piece over the horse's neck and back out to the other side and attached to the bridle. So it was a one-piece rein. And she just creatively figured out the conquistador bridles had 2 reins, but she creatively figured out if you let go of her rein, it would just fall on the horse's neck. It wouldn't drop to the ground where the horse could stumble on it or anything like that. She just kind of figured that out. And so the day came, after she'd been working those 4 or 5 days, she went up the valley and slipped her bridle, which would call today a hackamore, slipped it over the head of the stallion and led him back down to the camp. And the Aztecs, they were working on, making gardens in Cuto, and they were laying out foundation for where they put 3 small houses by the stream. And she led the stallion back down. And they all stopped working and watched her. And she led the stallion up to the stump. And he was fine. He followed her right down up to the stump where she'd been sitting making this stuff. She stepped on the stump, got a firm hold, of his mane and a hold of the rein, the single rein, and slipped up onto his back. Now remember, these horses weren't gentle; they weren't wild, and the stallion kind of pranced a little bit, and then he stopped, and she kind of gave him a little nudge with her heels, and he walked around, and she guided him this way and that with the reins. And Cuto was really proud. He was really proud. He said to the other guys, "Look what she's done. Look what she's done. Look at that horse. That horse is big and strong, and he just walks around doing what she wants him to do." And that began the training of the horses. And Rhea made bridles, hackamore bridles, for all 8 horses, for the other 7 horses. And as each one got done, the Aztecs started to ride. And Cuto proved Rhea was a complete natural. She was a complete natural. She moved with a horse. She was a complete natural. Cuto was the next best. The other guys had varying initial skill, but before long, they were all riding 7 horses, because there were 7 of them. They were riding 7 horses every day, and not all day because they had a lot of work to do. But they were riding them once a day, and they started out walking up through the grassy valley and doing this, that, and the other, and then they started going a little faster, and they're going a little faster, hanging on to the mane, but getting a feeling for what it was like with a horse to go faster and faster. Well, pretty soon they were cantering the horses, and they found out all the horses, as healthy as they now were, loved to run. So, in 2 weeks or so, they'd be riding through the grass of the valley, and someone would say, "Let's go," and they'd take off, all 7 of them on the horses, running up the valley through the grass with the 8th horse running along behind, and they all got better and better and better. And Rhea was the natural. She did a lot of riding on her own, and she found that these horses could turn fast at a run. She got thrown off, not thrown off by being bucked off, but the horses sometimes turned so fast at a run that she wasn't prepared for it, and she'd go off. And the grass was soft and everything, and the horse would stop, wait for her, and she'd get back on and do it again. But she got better and better and better at guiding these horses to make quick changes in direction at a high rate of speed. And she began teaching the others how to do that. And Cuto would say to the men, "I'll tell you something, we get enough horses, and we're going to be a very good match for the conquistadors. Their horses are not like our horses now are. Fat, happy, strong." So about once a week, Cuto and Rhea would go up to the cliff dwellings, and everything was going well up there. They were doing some gardening down in the main canyon. They always had a lookout, but the conquistadors, as they had suspected, as Feather had suspected, the conquistadors in the main thought they'd go on to the mountains way down south. Now, it happened that Lieutenant Marquez, was reluctant to take, they'd lost so many men in the ambush, was reluctant to take a few men, and the commander didn't want him to take a few men down to the mountains down to the south, because they could be ambushed in the mountains, in the canyons and stuff, pretty easily. So Marquez bided his time and just worked his patrols in the desert around the around Santa Fe. And one day, on such a patrol, he came to the rim of the big canyon. And this was some weeks, some number of weeks after the ambush and after the Pueblo Indians had disappeared. I mean, 8 or 10 weeks. And down in the main canyon, he saw two Indians on horses with a deer slung across the withers, that's the front of the horse, right behind its neck, of one of the horses. And he watched them. They didn't see him. He watched them walk up the canyon and then turn and disappear into the wall of the canyon across from him. It was perhaps 4 nights later in the camp, and Cuto and Rio were sleeping. They hadn't built their houses yet. They're still working on gardens and stuff. They were still camping. And Cuto woke up, sat bolt upright in the dark. It was a beautiful night. Stars overhead. Middle of the night, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. Stars overhead. Beautiful, beautiful night. And the medallion was burning hot on his chest. And that is the end of this episode. Now, if you've read this book to this point, you know what happens. If you haven't read this book to this point, why don't you have a go at what happens next? And we'll find out with the next episode. Good luck.